If Hitler was characterized by anything, it was for being one of the world leaders who organized the most public speeches and mass events throughout his political career. However, as the German armies began to suffer defeats on all fronts, mainly after 1943, his public appearances and speeches virtually disappeared. After the attack on July 20, 1944, the German leader had to appear before the cameras forcibly, so that everyone could verify that he was alive, and that his determination to win the war was stronger than ever. From then on, he disappeared again until practically the end of the war, when he made his last visit to the troops on the Eastern Front. Next in this program, we are going to see how was the last visit that the German leader made to his troops on the Oder Front, and what was the last message he gave to his soldiers and generals. In addition, this event is also the last time that Hitler left Berlin, just a few days after the Soviets began their final offensive, because once he returned on March 13, 1945, he never left the capital again. Before going into assessing this event, let's briefly see what was the last tour that the German leader made through Europe. As we have just indicated, after this attack, Hitler changed his residence quite frequently, either due to the crises that were taking place on the different fronts, or for health reasons, since in August 1944 he had to undergo a throat operation in Berlin. The German leader left his favorite residence in the Alps on October 16, 1944, never to return, heading back to the Wolfsten barracks in East Prussia. This complex had to be evacuated by November of that same year, due to the proximity of the Soviet troops that were already a few kilometers away, and Hitler had to stay in Berlin. Having re-established a new defensive line on the banks of the Vistula, Hitler's eyes now focused on the western sector, due to the imminent launch of a new German attack through the Ardennes. Due to this reason, Hitler moved from Berlin to his headquarters on the Western Front, known as the Eagle's Nest. He arrived at this barracks on December 11, 1944, 5 days before the launch of this final offensive, and he was there until January 15, 1945. During this stay, the fate of Germany was fully revealed. First of all, the last bet in the Ardennes failed completely, and it became clear that the German army was no longer capable of adequately carrying out any operation of real importance. A little later, and after having been turning a deaf ear to the warnings of the imminent Soviet offensive on the Vistula, the Red Army attacked on January 12, completely wiping out the German armies in the area. Due to this total collapse of the Eastern Front, on January 15, Hitler had to definitively leave his headquarters in the Eagle's Nest, to go to Berlin. Once there, totally catastrophic events for Germany did not stop occurring and overlapping with each other. His first lodging in Berlin was an apartment in the former Reich Chancellery, which he had to leave in mid-February as the bombing raids on the German capital intensified. In this way, he had to move permanently to the underground bunker, where he would spend a total of 2.5 months. A few days before, on January 30th, and while everything was falling apart in Germany, Hitler gave his last speech on the radio in which he addressed the German people. In it he insisted that it did not matter how serious the crisis they were experiencing at that moment might be, because at the end of it all they would end up overcoming it. However, a few days later, Zhukov's vanguard units reached the Vistula River, and were located some 70 kilometers from the German capital. Although a few years earlier it would have been cause for alarm that enemy troops should get so close to Hitler, at that time it was no longer a surprise. Goebbels hoped that in this desperate situation, Hitler would be more active than ever towards the civilian population and soldiers, and initiate a series of public events. Basically what the propaganda minister wanted was to have Hitler haranguing the nation on the radio on an almost daily basis, since it was now when they most needed to keep their morale as high as possible. However, the German leader was against this idea, and although his activity was frantic inside the bunker with his generals, he did not want to make any radio intervention after the one on January 30th. The reason he gave was that he had nothing positive to say, and that his words, empty and without force, would do more harm than anything else among the German population. In addition, the impression that people who had not seen him for a long time had of him was quite bad, since they found him very deteriorated, so that said public act had a high risk of having negative effects. Although Hitler could be right on this matter, Goebbels insisted that the German leader should organize some public event, and he insisted every day until he got it. So, once Hitler reluctantly agreed, the propaganda minister began to organize the preparations for the event. The visit was set at one of the 9th Army barracks, which was about 60 kilometers by road from the center of Berlin, and this in turn was about 20 kilometers from the front line on the Oder. In this way, it was more or less at the limit of the Soviet artillery, and was totally vulnerable to any Allied air raids. As we can see, the risk was high, but at that time it was practically impossible to keep the German leader completely safe. With ample security throughout the route, Hitler's entourage left Berlin by car on the morning of March 13th, taking about 2 hours to complete the 60 kilometers to one of the 9th Army headquarters west of Riesen. In an attempt to prevent any Soviet attack in the area during the visit, this meeting had been convened in total secrecy, and the commanders of the different German armies on the Oder had been called to it. In it was intended that the different generals inform Hitler firsthand of the situation that was being experienced at the front. However, and as we have said before, the main objective was the propaganda act itself, since it was not necessary for Hitler and his entourage to travel to that town to find out anything new. Intent on looking his best, Hitler wore the same clothing that he had worn during his campaign events in Poland and France. In addition to all the generals who were waiting for him inside, in which we can highlight Bussy, at the entrance to the castle where the meeting was to take place, there were hundreds of soldiers who cheered for Hitler when he arrived. The generals who received him inside the castle later stated that they were very shocked by his appearance, and that they saw him in very poor condition. One of them wrote in his diary that he had seen the Führer's face completely white as lime, and that his eyes, although before they had transmitted strength, were now completely dark. General Bussy, commander of the 9th Army, was in charge of giving Hitler a general presentation of the situation. In it he warned that the German defensive line was quite weak, and that a powerful Soviet attack was expected in the coming weeks. After this presentation by General Bussy, the German leader took the floor. During his speech, Hitler spoke about the need to maintain the defensive line along the Oder at all costs, since, as was evident, this was the last defense of the German Reich. Finally, Hitler alerted his generals that Germany's reserves were totally exhausted, and those weapons and ammunition with which they had been endowed were the last ones available. To give a piece of information, it should be noted that German vehicles were prohibited from starting the engine unless it was absolutely urgent, and the artillery pieces had only 2 projectiles per day, which were being saved for the final Soviet offensive. Despite this situation, and in an attempt to encourage them, Hitler spoke about the imminent arrival of new weapons that were going to turn the situation around, so they had to resist and buy time as possible. Once this meeting was over, the German leader left the castle and passed the soldiers again, always with his left hand in his pocket. After this, his entourage went back to Berlin, and according to what some of his companions wrote, Hitler did not say anything on the entire return trip. This was his last trip out of Berlin, after which he had a month and a half left in which he would practically not leave his bunker in the Chancellery again. Finally, his last public act was on April 20th, when he honored some members of the Hitler Youth who had participated in the first combats of the Battle of Berlin. Would you like to know how was the life of the German civilian population during these last weeks, or how were the final combats? I leave you in the description the program in which we analyze what happened to the population of Berlin during the battle for the city, and what happened to them once the battle ended. Thank you all so much for being part of this community, especially the sponsors who make this possible. Subscribe and share this program if you liked it, and see you as always every Thursday and Sunday. See you soon.